Hi everyone, this is James from the Freemasons and welcome to the first of 2 tutorials covering analog style processing in digital systems. This first tutorial will take place in Logic Audio and then I'll quickly show you Harrison's off the wall but excellent Mixbus DAW. And then the second completely separate tutorial will cover commercially available plugins with an analog character in Ableton Live. So look, first of all, just want to talk about the components that make analog what it is. And the first are the input and output transformers of any high-end analog device. Now, they're magnetic in the way that they transfer the audio from the outside world into them. And because of that, what comes in through the first winding and what leaves into the equipment has often been changed in some way. But it's changed in a way that we seem to like. There's often a bit of a bump in the bass, there's some filtration, so the real sub is kind of taken off. Some of the top end is kind of gently shaved off, but it does it in a way that we seem to really appreciate. The second is the most famous component of an analog nature, and that's the valve. It's still used in very high-end processors today. You can see how many pictures just a quick search of audio valve brought up on Google. And to cut a long story short, it tends to add extra information that wasn't there, which is again a form of distortion. But these harmonics, as they're known, within valve circuitry are very, very pleasing to our ears. They seem to add that warmth, fatness and character that always gets talked about. And the last is what was considered by many in the 90s becoming a redundant format, which was magnetic tape, which is now seeing a revival, same as vinyl. It's a magnetic storage medium in either multi-track or stereo format that imparts its own very, very special character. Tape, and you can, because of the amount of emulations around at the moment, you can see how popular it was, compresses the signal, distorts it. So yet again, what comes out of a tape machine after being stored is not always what went into it, but what comes out has been softened and generally sweetened in a way that is pleasing to our ears. Now, I mention all this in detail because to achieve any kind of analog style processing, you have to understand exactly what's going on. So we have 3 familiar components of analog processing. We have filtration, and we have compression, and we have distortion. So let's try and emulate them in Logic Audio. Now, we're going to use a track that we're actually literally just in the middle of working with, and we've got a kind of section that we bounced out with a drum track. And then we were adding some synth parts too, and it's a collaboration that we will be working on with the wonderful Joel Edwards. Now, as you can hear, it's retro, and it's sort of referencing all of those points in the 80s where everything was mixed on analog. There were very, very limited digital systems, especially at the kind of time point this is referencing. I can give you a little example here of what a tape machine will kind of apply. We've got these ganged inputs which allow us to kind of, as you can see, as I move the input, the output decreases and vice versa. That means that we can pretty much show you the effect of a tape machine, really push it into the red as well, with the volume remaining constant. So let me just play the track back and we'll feed it into the tape machine. Now, as you can see, when it goes right into the red, it gets pretty nasty. But up until that point, you can hear some nice things happening. Everything just tends to glue in a little bit, and everything just kind of feels like it belongs a bit. And things get weightier. And if you think about what's happening is the fronts of the drums are getting squished, but the body of the drums are still being allowing to come through. So you're effectively compressing as well. Now, that's really important. We're going to take that tape machine out, and we're going to try and emulate some of that kind of thing on a few parts. Let's just take those out, and we'll just stick, and the vocals as well, and we'll just stick to the drums, the bass, and this kind of polysynth and the guitars. So let's think about what the tape machine's doing. For a start, it's all the magnetic systems within the tape machine are rolling some of the frequencies off. So if, say, we take this drum track, we can start straight away to kind of emulate what it's doing. There it is flat. I'm going to pull up an EQ. I'm going to roll some of the bottom off, and I'm actually going to take some of the top off as well. It's quite steep. So we'll take the slope of this filter. It was set at 12. We'll take it to 6, and I'm just going to set it to probably about 16. Now, a lot of records from the 70s and 80s that we're all maybe trying to reference from a reference point of view, a retro point of view at the moment, were all cut on analog machines and all cut on analog desks. So these kind of frequency responses tend to happen a lot. A modern version of when it's been put on deliberately, or fairly modern, it was the 90s, I suppose, so it's over 20 years old now. I once met Al Stone, very famous producer who made the Jamiroquai album Travelling Without Moving. And he said when they started the mix, they literally went to the SSL on every single channel. They took it down to about 15K. There was absolutely hardly any frequencies above that getting onto the record, and it sounded like a 70s record because of it. So have a little go with that kind of thing, but let me show you kind of what it will do to a drum track. And it just starts to round it off a bit. Now, what we can do then is, it may sound completely silly, but we're actually going to then add a shelf. So we're almost EQing in to that roll-off there. Now, I'm sure you can hear what that's done already. It's added top end, but without any of the brittleness that you would find if you had that off, and you can see what it's doing there. We don't need all that stuff up there, and that certainly doesn't sound analog. Analog machines will just kind of start to get rid of that. So this is a great way to think, and sometimes it's really useful also on the bass end. For example, if we put a nice low shelf on, say at about 90, then start to roll off as well. And the interaction between these two bands is the most important thing, and these two up here as well is the most important thing you can learn about EQing, because it's the old thing of what you give with one hand you want to take away with the other, and it really does work. Now if you're obviously you're dealing with huge amounts of sub, if you're doing bass music, that's probably you're going to have to be careful around here, but this is a great thing to learn if you're doing house or pop or anything like that. Now the next thing that would be added by an analog device would be a level of distortion, and Logic has a brilliant little distortion module that most people overlook. It's in the distortion section, and it's called Overdrive. And the reason most people completely overlook it, I think, is it normally starts like this, and you go, well, that's not what I want at all, so you just completely forget about it. But play with this tone control, turn it all the way up, and then just start to add a little bit in, and look at what happens. And what I'm doing there is just equalizing the input and output. So in other words, what I'm adding, I'm then taking away by its output fader. So there it is. Let's hear it with and without. Sounds absolutely wonderful, and it's just adding those extra harmonics. And I think I'm right in saying that this overdrive plugin that's built in adds third harmonics to your signal, which is the same kind of harmonics that a tube will generate and nice sounding analog equipment. So that's the first thing. Now, sorry, the first two things that a tape machine might do. The second is obviously compression. As you're starting to push into things, and even though our overdrive is going to be adding a little bit of compression, we're also going to add some tasty stuff here. I've got it on RMS here. Someone picked me up on that from one of the last tutorials. And we're going to use a nice bit of opto. Opto compression is fairly slow, to be honest. And I'm also just going to twirl the compressor open, because there's a little known function here. You have a mix control in the Logic compressor. A lot of people haven't really discovered this yet, but this allows you to use this as a parallel compressor. So in other words, 0% means absolutely no compression, 50% is half of the signals going through unaffected, half of the signals going through from this compressor, and 100% is as it was. So let's dial in some tasty compression, and then we'll just pull the mix back a little bit. So as you can see, we're starting to get that lovely fat snare slam that is the holy grail of drum compression, and I'm just going to bring the mix slider back a bit now. And as you see, that mix slider allows me to do fairly heavy-handed compression here, but actually still keep control of it and have the original dynamics of the sound coming through. So let's have a quick listen to our drum track, particularly as it comes in, because that's always the important part of a drum track, the kind of kick-in point. Yeah, sounds tasty already. Now let me show you. I'm just going to duplicate this drum track and quickly switch my tools over. And what I'm going to do is do you 2 bars of unprocessed and 2 bars of processed, so you can see the difference in between. So on our second channel here, how I did that was just use this new track with duplicate settings, which allows me to take any track, creates a new, completely separate track instrument with the same plugins on. In fact, we will just make sure. Okay, so here we can see them exactly the same channel, exactly the same level. One of them just hasn't got the processing in, and this is the difference. Now, I had a bit of an unfair advantage of level there, so I've just kind of re-leveled in between, but you can just hear how much bigger those drums sound. Also, if you're on laptop speakers at the moment and you're saying, well, I can't really hear much difference, well, put your headphones on and stick this onto HD. You will never hear the difference in weight just on laptop speakers alone. So, yeah, please plug your headphones in and you'll really be able to hear what we're up to here. So, anyway, let's just straighten all this out. Okay, so that's that starting to sound tasty. Now let's try some of the tricks that people in the analog world used to use, and that's EQing into this overdrive and compression that's emulating our tape machine at the moment. And you'll hear that the EQ starts to respond a little bit tastier than it would do if it was just by itself, with the overdrive and the compression in there as well. It's really starting to work. And the reason engineers would heavily EQ into tape is that tape would eventually, after being going around on the machine during a recording session, start to actually wear out. There was a bit of a kind of fashion to EQ some presence into the tape machines, or into the signal going to the tape machines, knowing that it would probably get kind of worn off later on. So you get some of those EQs coming through on some of the records that we all love. Okay, next thing, let's kind of emulate the same thing with this bass part. And yeah, again, it sounds great, but it just needs the weight and the power that we kind of expect from this kind of thing. So I'm going to go straight in with an overdrive. And I'm going to start with this one, and then you notice I've left a gap here. I'm just going to place the EQ channel later, but I just want to kind of get the general drive and power right first. Once again, I'm just going to equalize my levels there, so the what I'm gaining is roughly being taken away on the output if this thing will stay still. And I'm just going to actually copy this compressor. I do that by holding down the Apple Command key and the Alt key, and you can drag the plugin across from that one. I may just tweak the threshold. Let's add a little bit more ratio. And this compressor also has a really extra tasty function that I showed on one of the parallel tutorials, this clipping output, which emulates the distortion that would happen when you kind of overdrive the output of an analog compressor, which is some of the weight that we're also looking for. So I'm going to use the compressor gain output now to just go into that soft clip. And you can automatically hear it suddenly come to life. Okay, so once again now I'm just going to actually start EQing into the compression and the overdrive. I'm going to roll the real sub off, and quite steeply as well. This kind of bass part doesn't need anything really beneath about 35. And same with the top. And this is one trick with the top. So I'm just going to play through, and I'm going to slowly bring the low pass filter down until I reach a point where I'm starting to lose information and the part doesn't sound right. Then I know just to pull back a little bit, so if I come all the way down here and it's too dull, I'll just go back up to there, and then I know I've hit the right spot. Now that's great. I'm now going to EQ just a little bit of presence back into that signal. And what we're doing here is really making sure that the top end is not full of all sorts of fizz. And I know modern records have really contained an awful lot of fizz, especially with the big synthy stuff that's come out of EDM and all the rest of it. But if we're trying to make everything sound a bit analog and a bit warmer, which I can guarantee you there's going to be is going to be all the rage in the coming years, then cutting frequencies out of that range that just aren't needed will really, really help. But once again, as I say, I'm just going to add some presence into that curve just till we get some of the bite on the bass back. And even add a couple of little tasty peaks here and there. And I can also add a nice shelf into this cutoff as well, same as we were doing with the drums. And once again, let me just do this sort of chop function where I show you the difference between the original and our process version. So process version first and then original. Oh, by the way, if you ever want to know the quick way to divide something up in Logic, if you hold down, I mean, I've got my scissors set on the second tool, which is when I hit the command key on the keyboard. But if I then add the Alt key to that, you'll see a little plus comes up on the pair of scissors, and look what happens when I make one cut. It just chops the entire section into whatever division that you had. So you can really go to town with going in on a quarter beat. And this is how some people are doing some of the crazy chop-up stuff at the moment, rendering stuff to audio, then just cutting it all into 16ths and then chopping it about. Anyway, we digress. Here's the difference. Now I'm just going to add the guitar into the mix here. And we'll play with this. Now let's use the same principle. Let's get our little overdrive set up first. In fact, let's just do a blank one. There's only a few parameters on this. Is the beauty of this plugin. So once again, I'm going to first of all find the point where I'm actually going to set the top of this and find out the bit of information that I don't need, and then get the amount of drive kind of right. Okay, that sounds nice. Drop it in. In fact, we will do. I should rebalance here. I'm not taking my own advice there. Okay, so once again, we'll start off with some tasty roll-offs, and I'm going to come right down on the guitar probably. And the reason being is we probably want to really push some poshness into that sound. So let's really bring out some zing, but with a nice roll off. There's a bit of a weird harmonic going on at the top here. Bit of a surgical EQ there just to get rid of a really nasty ring. There's quite, in guitars you've got to really watch it because there's always some particular peaks coming off the amps. And we're going to add a bit of weight as well. Now normally you end up your life killing everything between 200 and 300 hertz, but with certain sounds, especially guitars where there's a nice rhythm, as long as they're well played or they're well sampled and chopped in as this one is, then you can really go to town with it here because you'll often find some tasty stuff. I am just going to really run this roll off tight and add what may seem like a silly thing, but okay, so we're starting to get there. The one last thing I will just put in is this polysynth, and I'll do this very quick. And you can hear that needs a hell of a lot of work to make it right. So first of all, let's get our distortion right. Sounds like it could do with a bit of catch at the front. So let's bring one of our compressors across. It's kind of missing the attack portion a little bit, so we can probably drag this out with this compressor. Let me just turn the clip off. In fact, I will put the soft clip back on this one as well, so it's really slamming. That's what we like to see, levels coming up. You see that just here, it's literally coming up and not going any further. So you can already see with just some very simple plugins within Logic, we can emulate what is going on within analog systems and really start to fatten everything up. Now let me quickly, what we'll do, I'll take each one of these main tracks, we'll duplicate the plugins, sorry, we'll duplicate the information, oh, being far too tidy there, and I'll kind of roughly show you a section where each one dives in and out, so you can hear where we were and where we are now. Now, okay, there's some level stuff there, so let me just re-level quickly. So now we should be able to show you a very good before and after. Now, everything that I've done there is using, as you can see, just the Logic plugins. You can see this inflator here, that's just to stop the overs as we're going out. But it just shows you the power of the stuff that's kind of already built in, if you know kind of what you're trying to emulate. So there's just one last thing I want to show you, which is this very odd DAW from Harrison. Now, Harrison are a console manufacturer, and you'll see their consoles in film studios. And traditionally, they've always been known as having a kind of great analog skill set. And they've built this kind of weird extended version of a DAW called Ardor, and it's designed to sound very, very analog and to react in the same way that, say, a desk and a tape machine might. I'm still confused as to exactly why they've done it, but I don't kind of question it because it can do some absolutely stunning things. And let me just kind of show you roughly what this thing's capable of. Now, it looks horrible, I must admit. I don't know what they've done from a graphical point of view, but there's some very interesting things here to kind of notice straight away, and that is all of these VUs here, the tape saturation, and it works almost out of the packaging in a parallel manner. So we've just got one channel here with our track on, which I'll just play. And I tend to use this particular system for this quite a bit, just to put final mixes in and then kind of tweak up and get a bit more oomph into them and a bit more analog warmth. It's very simple the way it's set up. You have a number of tracks, and then these tracks have some auxiliary sends, like you would see on a desk, that are going out to a series of auxiliaries, effectively, or bus returns. But these bus returns are designed to work in parallel, so you can do some very clever things. But first of all, let me just show you the basic EQ. Now, on the channel here, it looks incredibly simple. You've just got frequency and gain. But it's what Harrison have learnt over the years about digital EQs that's important, because it sounds phenomenal. I'm just going to EQ the basic track up here, and then we'll get into the parallels of it. Now, I'm sure you can hear from that, that's already added some lift, but it's done it in a way that you would expect analog gear to behave as opposed to digital. As I say, so simple, there's no cue controls on this, it just sounds good. Now, what I tend to do with these is then we start going on to these auxiliary sends and using these return buses in parallel. I don't put any plugins into them, I just use the tone controls and the tape saturation that's built in here to use and abuse it. Let me show you what I mean. I'm going to turn on the auxiliary send from our channel strip here. One, and that's now going to be coming into here. I'm going to solo this return channel, just bring it down a bit, and I'm going to EQ an awful lot of top into this particular channel, and then do our trick of bringing it in on top of the original. There is also a compressor section, and you have the choice of a leveler, which is a bit like an LA2A, a kind of optical style standard compressor, and a limiter. And what I'm going to do is probably limit just the very edges of this signal that's going to have a lot of high frequency content in it, and then it should emulate some of the kind of tape stuff. The tape sat will tweak as well. So look, I'll just carry on and do it. Now, it sounds as tinny as an old radio, but that's obviously not how you'd want your entire track to sound. But remember, we're using this in parallel. The full track here is still playing back. It's just muted at the moment because of the solo. So this submix now, we're just going to bring in slowly and add a bit of this top end to it. Now I'm going to balance it by turning on the second return, which is this one, and we're going to heavily EQ bass into this. Use a little bit of tape saturation and some very clever, fairly slow compression, just so we get a bit of kick action. And once again, that's boxy as hell, but if I start to now feed that into our signals, look at what happens. Now I'm going to add, using this third one, we'll turn this on as well, I'm going to create an incredibly overly compressed version. Really get it pumping, and then let's feed that back in. So that's starting to sound fat already. If I just take the limit off the master channel here, you can see you have a tape saturation control and even tone controls on the output. You can start to use your plugins here as well if you want to. But let me just show you what it is with these extras turned off. And we can go even madder and really hit a limiter on the fourth one. Now, as you can see, that just adds the weight and all of the warmth that we were talking about. And it's kind of automatically controlled by just the way this whole thing reacts. It's kind of a bit like the heat system that I think you can buy as an optional extra for Pro Tools, but just seems to be warmer. I wish they would make this into a plugin that we could just use on all of the other systems, because having to pull things in and out of this can be a bit complicated because it doesn't work like anything else. But it's absolutely stunning for tweaking master mixes. I've never done a full stem mix in here, but I'm sure someone will at one stage within dance music, but it's definitely worth having a look at because it's quite a cheap option.